The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, an investigation of the religious right's rise to political power, a history of the rise and fall of organized labor in America and what that means for its future, plus Bill Press with ABC's chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl, on his new book, Front Row at the Trump Show. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Katherine Stewart's newest book explores the rise of the religious right in America and its vast reach into American politics. She warns that the end result is fundamentally anti-democratic, and at such a critical point in time, it is dangerously anti-science. And we say hello to Katherine Stewart, who's been reporting at the intersection of religion, politics, policy, and education for over a decade. In 2014, she was named Person of the Year by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And her newest book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Katherine Stewart, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Let's start by describing who you're talking about in this book. I mean, how does a Christian nationalist differ from other Christians?
The first thing to know about Christian nationalism is it is not a religion. It's a political ideology. Its representatives insist that the foundation of legitimate government is bound up with a reactionary understanding of a particular religion. It basically says that the U.S. is founded on the Bible and can succeed only if it stays true to this foundation. So Christian nationalism is also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating large segments of the public and for concentrating power in the hands of a new elite. Now, I want to say something about what the movement is not. It is not just about evangelicals. It does include many evangelicals, but it excludes many evangelicals too, and it includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. So what unites the movement is not a distinct theology, but a political vision. I mean, we have to remember there's a whole movement of religious people out there who think Christianity is about helping the poor, not beating them up, about affirming people's rights, not denying them rights, and about being open and tolerant and embracing a pluralistic world and not seeing people as, people first and tribe second. So I think there are some other important things to know about religious nationalism. It makes use of religion, but it's not really trying to achieve religious, social, or cultural aims. It's really trying to achieve political power. And the movement is fundamentally hostile to representative democracy. It won't be pacified with a few policy changes or by trading away rights. That will only sort of push the movement further in its desire for control.
Now, the book describes a universe that goes far beyond just churches. What kinds of institutions are part of this world?
The movement consists of a dense ecosystem of for-profit and nonprofit groups, and they include right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy organizations, data initiatives, media and networking groups. Its leadership cadre consists of a number of often personally interconnected activists and politicians. And it gets much of its power direction from an informal club of funders, a number of them belonging to these extended hyper-wealthy families, some of which I write about in my book. It really took me some time to navigate the sea of acronyms and funding schemes and kinship and policy networks. And I really did try to lay out as much of this ecosystem in my book as I possibly could. But the important thing to understand about its collective effort is not the variety of it or the breadth of it, but the profound source of unity, which is a common political vision.
One of the arguments that you make, and it's expressed in the title, is that this movement isn't as much about a social or cultural agenda, but more simply about power. But power to do what?
Well, the movement seeks to solidify and maintain political power for themselves and their allies. I mean, they just want access and power to increase the flow of private and public money in their direction, and to enact economic policies that are favorable to their most well-resourced funders. Also through this sort of specious idea of religious liberty. It's a term you keep hearing over and over again, but it's really not about religious liberty. They seek to give certain favored groups in society, those who believe correctly, the power to discriminate against other people in society. And the movement is hostile to the idea of pluralism and equal rights for all citizens.
The book illustrates how Christian nationalists have used their power to embed themselves deeply in U.S. domestic and foreign policy. We're all certainly aware of how that's worked on issues such as reproductive choice. What are some of the more surprising policy areas where Christian nationalists have had influence?
I think the influence of this movement on economic policy is vastly underappreciated. People still think the movement is really about the so-called culture wars like abortion and marriage equality. But when you look at the political messages in more detail, and especially the ones that they're sending to one another in the forums that they share, and to the elites in power and to their funders, a lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible favors no taxes or low taxes, how the Bible is against regulation of businesses, against environmental protection legislation, against the social safety net, unless the money for social services and that social safety net is passing through churches and religious organizations first. And again, we hear that term religious liberty. It's always been cast as this idea, cake bakers just don't want to have to sell a wedding cake to same-sex couple. It's not about that. They're using this idea to secure existing taxpayer exemptions and subsidies and grants and vouchers, but also to increase the flow of public money in their direction. And we have to remember that religious organizations already obtain really substantial sources of public funding, but they want to increase that flow of public money. And in many instances, they're arguing that a failure to have taxpayer funding for their religious schools and other organizations amounts to a violation of their religious liberty. So when you listen to some of the leaders of the movement, I'm thinking about people I've written about like David Barton or Ralph Drollinger, the expansiveness of their positions on these domestic, economic, and foreign policy issues hits home the fact that this is a political movement and not merely a stance in the so-called culture war.
Christian nationalism is clearly aligned with Republican politics. But was that always the case, and do most Republicans welcome their loyalty?
There are two parts to this question, and I'm going to answer them separately. So,
fair enough.
Was that always the case? Absolutely not. For one thing, look, the movement promotes this fiction that it rose up in reaction to Roe v. Wade. But we have to remember when Roe versus Wade was passed, most Republican Protestants welcomed some form of liberalization of abortion law. The Southern Baptist Convention actually hailed the decision as a kind of sensible middle ground. Reagan passed the first most liberal abortion law in the country in 1967. Barry Goldwater, that great conservative hero, supported liberalization of abortion law, at least early in his career. This is a fun fact. His wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Can you imagine the wife of a Republican conservative hero doing that today? Billy Graham himself, this is another good one. He himself echoed widely shared Protestant sentiments when he said in 1968, "I believe in Planned Parenthood." He said, "I would in general disagree with the anti-abortion stance, which he saw as a Catholic stance." I mean, Billy Graham said that. But over time, pro-choice voices were purged from the Republican Party. The sort of pro-life religion that we see today is really a modern creation, but it was created for political purposes. I mean, when you look at how the movement coalesced, it has its roots in our history. And there was this movement, leaders of an earlier sort of form of like an intellectual movement called the New Right that eventually morphed and played a huge role in contributing to today's Christian nationalist movement. One of its leaders was Paul Weyrich. So there's a moment when Weyrich and other leaders of what would become today's religious right were going down a list of issues that could bring the movement together. One was unfair tax treatment in their view of these racially segregated academies. It's really quite ugly. The women's rights movement was another issue that they were really in opposition to, but the ERA at the time was sort of going down in flames. There were several other issues on this list. And they crossed one after the other off to realize they wouldn't work to unite the movement and to find their enemies. So they came down to abortion, and Weyrich said, wow, that could work. So they really settled on this issue as a way to solidify their movement for political purposes. Now, the second part of your question is, do most Republicans welcome their loyalty? And I would have to say that many people who identify as Republicans do. Mitch McConnell certainly does. He stands up at Values Voters conferences and Road to Majority conferences that I attend, and he's always, saying, you guys are fabulous, and aren't I doing for you everything that you want? But, it's important to remember that many other people who have identified previously as Republicans feel like they really don't have a political party that represents them anymore. And,
Are they independent?
I think those folks, I think people go in different directions when they feel like the party no longer represents them. But here's the fact that really matters. This group, is a minority in our society, but they're punching above their political weight because they are so organized and networked, and they know when to vote in unity when necessary, and they know how to get out the vote very strategically. In a country where 40 to 50% of people simply don't vote, you don't need a majority to dominate. And in a system as politically fragmented as ours, I think even small groups, if united, can dominate.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Katherine Stewart. Her newest book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Katherine, as your book makes it clear, Christian nationalism is part of why we have Donald Trump. He's not the type of politician you would find in the front pew every Sunday. I don't know that he would know what a church even looked like, but that's my opinion. Anyway, why has he been such an appealing candidate to them?
I think a lot of people think it's just transactional. They think he's going to enact economic policies favorable to their pocketbooks, or put in judicial appointments that are favorable to their concerns in the so-called culture wars. But it really goes beyond that. I think that Trump's alleged character, and I mean, that works for some number of voters, of course,
sure,
to save the babies, whatever. To date, he has actually appointed 192 judicial appointees to the federal court. So that's over 22% of the federal judiciary. But it's more than that. I think his alleged character defects are in fact a virtue for America's religious nationalists. They made this explicit by comparing him to biblical figures like King David and King Cyrus. He is cast for them as an imperfect vessel. God chose to enact his will and restore America to its so-called Judeo-Christian roots. And I think that that's because, they don't really want a seat like at the noisy table of American democracy. They want to smash the table. They want to sort of replace our system of representative democracy and take the nation in a whole other direction. And so an authoritarian leader is much more, in line with that. I mean, compared to what happens in some other countries, let's look at what Putin has done in Russia, or what Orban does in Hungary, or Erdogan does in Turkey, when they bind themselves, these leaders who may not be the most sort of godly people themselves, they bind themselves very closely to religious conservative leaders in their own country in order to solidify a more authoritarian form of power. We rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism. And that's what we're seeing with Trump and our own hyper-conservative religious folks today.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we approach the next election, this book is a warning about democracy and a call to protect it. Beyond money, How else are Christian nationalists having an influence on the electoral process?
In multiple ways. They have these very high-tech data mining operations. There's a creation of a right-wing propaganda sphere. I don't think the influence of that can be underestimated. And there are these slick marketing campaigns. Another way is through conservative-leaning churches. Leaders of the movement have found that pastors drive votes, and they organize pastors into networks, get them all on the same page politically, and give them tools to help them turn out the votes for hyper-conservative candidates. So from their perspective, vast numbers of America's conservative churches have been converted into what are essentially loyal cells of a shadow political party. They give them these really sophisticated messaging tools, from voter guides that leave no doubt about which way to vote if you want to reflect your biblical values, to videos that they can air in church, things like tools for establishing within churches political action committees, or what they call culture impact teams, that are designed to turn out congregants to vote for the right candidates. And I think it's worth pointing out too that a lot of the movement's strategy comes from these well-funded legal advocacy groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, whose leaders have asserted that our laws should be based on their interpretations of the Bible rather than on long-standing democratic and constitutional principles.
Wow. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, you recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the religious right and its relationship to science. You mention a group called the Cornwall Alliance and its rejection of environmentalism. What's wrong with environmentalism from their point of view?
They assert that environmentalism is a false theology. And I think there are really two factors at play here. The first is that there's a hostility to science, and that's characterized the more extreme forms of religious nationalism in the United States. And it reflects a long-standing hostility to science among sort of biblical literalists. That goes back to, at least since the 19th century through the 20th century. It usually shows up in hostility to teaching about evolution or climate science. And today, indeed, the hardcore of climate deniers is concentrated among people who identify as religiously conservative Republicans. I think there's another factor here, and it goes back to something we discussed earlier about the factor of money. The movement has allied itself completely with the libertarian, pro-corporate, economic, conservative wing of the Republican Party. Its leading figures and many of the think tanks that are really influential in the movement have received hefty funding from some of the plutocrats of the energy industry. I'm thinking offhand about the Wilkes brothers, these fracking billionaires, thinking about the Kochs who've contributed to some of the right-wing policy groups and think tanks that also work with Christian nationalists. They're constantly demonizing government and environmental regulations because they interfere with corporate profits. So I think the hostility to climate science really works on those two different levels.
How are you seeing these anti-science ideas being played out in reaction to the pandemic?
Oh boy, there are a number of ways in which the movement bears some responsibility to the incompetence, the current incompetence among Trump and his cronies in the national response. So first and foremost, the movement promotes this anti-science culture that rejects the evidence of science, critical thinking, expertise, and that's obviously contributed to our inability to address this crisis in an evidence-based fashion. Misinformation is rife in hyper-conservative religious communities that were all in for Trump. And you saw Jim Baker hawking these sort of phony cures, and other leaders sort of saying, oh, we're gonna hold big services, and God is gonna heal us, and this virus is going to, purify the land. Kind of scary stuff like that. So I think
so you don't need to go to Home Depot or to Lowe's anymore. Your land will be purified.
Exactly. I think this is something that's really alarming to all of us. In the Trump years, we've seen the breakdown of formal expertise and an increasing premium paid for political loyalty. So a lot of the folks surrounding Trump aren't there because they're the experts in their field necessarily. They're there because they hew to this sort of hyper-conservative religious ideology, but also more to the point that they're willing to praise Trump and sort of prostrate themselves before him. And their motivations are guided a pursuit of power and less by, unfortunately, their idea of like serving the wider public interest. And again, I think, as we were talking earlier about that right-wing media sphere, I think the movement has driven the Republican Party toward hyper-partisanization, which is a kind of all spin, all politics view of the world. There's no interest in reality. Everything is spun for a political game. Remember when the virus started to make the news and it was cast as a hoax, like Jerry Falwell Jr. said, oh, this is like a plot against the president. I mean, ordinarily the kinds of, this type of behavior, its consequences don't show up for some time, but in the case of a global pandemic that's killing people, its consequences are really too obvious to ignore. It's too bad.
And somebody has the audacity to refer to Anthony Fauci as some sort of deep state, left-wing Hillary Clinton stooge. He's the smartest guy in the room. Come on.
I know. It's like entering like a house of mirrors. You know what I mean? Like when reality is so distorted, but as soon as you ask that question, you're already participating in the madness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's really toxic.
It's like rewriting Alice in Wonderland or something. I'm not sure what, but before we let you go, what's the right way to fight the power of this movement while still respecting religious liberty?
I don't think meaningful civic engagement interferes with the religious liberty of anyone. They're going to hurl that accusation at you because, but it has nothing to do with meaningful civic engagement and meaningful political engagement. There's nothing about getting out the vote, investing in data, media, and messaging, which is, by the way, what the right does, that interferes with anybody's liberty. This is, in fact, a sort of right of our democracy. In fact, I believe it's my religious right to engage in civic life and political life in meaningful ways. The religious right is using the tools of democracy to tear down democracy. And I continue to believe that those same tools can be used to restore it.
Katherine Stewart, again, the book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Katherine, we certainly appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back and talk more about it down the road. Thank you so much. It's great to chat with you. And great to have you with us. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, rebuilding worker power after decades of decline. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
What's the matter with the post office? The U.S. Postal Service, I mean, the corporate hierarchy that runs this enormously popular public institution. Yes, I know that USPS has lost revenue it traditionally got from first-class mail delivery, But I also know that letter carriers and postal workers have offered many excellent ideas for expanding the services that USPS can deliver, thus increasing both revenue and the importance of maintaining these community treasures. Yet, the Postal Board of Governors, which includes corporate interests that would profit by killing the public service, seems intent on, guess what, killing it. The board's only idea is to cut services and shut down hundreds of local post offices. Incredibly, their list of closures include the historic post office in Philadelphia's Old City, the very building where Ben Franklin presided as our country's first Postmaster General, appointed by the Continental Congress in 1775. All across the country, post offices that are invaluable artistic and historic assets are slated to be sold to developers. One is the marvelous 1935 Bronx Post Office with classical architectural flourishes and 13 museum-worthy murals. It's not just a post office, says one customer fighting the closure. It's part of my life. No one feels that way about a FedEx warehouse. Yet, says a USPS spokeswoman dismissively, the 4-story building is severely underused. This is Jim Hightower saying, so use it. Put a coffee shop in it, a public internet facility, a library and museum, a one-stop government services center, and, as USPS employees have suggested, a public bank offering basic services to the thousands of neighborhood people ignored by commercial banks. Come on, USPS, show a little creativity and gumption, and remember that service is a key part of your name.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Stephen Greenhouse is one of our nation's most respected labor journalists. His newest book spans a century of America's labor movement to understand its decline and what workers are doing today to reclaim their power. And we say hello to Stephen Greenhouse, American labor and workplace journalist and writer. He covered labor for the New York Times for 31 years. He's the author of The Big Squeeze and, most recently, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Stephen Greenhouse, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. You write about some of the more dramatic moments in the American movement. One of the earliest is a 1909 strike by immigrant female garment workers. Why is this an important story?
It's an important story for several reasons. First, it was during the industrialization of the United States. A lot of immigrants had moved from Europe, and they had very low-wage jobs. They worked 50, 60 hours a week. Conditions were not very good. Most of them were women, and they were abused, exploited. They had to pay for their own needle and thread. They worked long hours. Many complained that they worked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. They didn't even see the sun many days. And basically, the workers got fed up. This is a few years, but right before the horrible Triangle Fire in 1911, when 146 workers died. But New York was the largest city in the country. The garment industry was the largest industry in New York at the time. And the workers got fed up with the abusive conditions. And when they went on strike, it was the largest strike in history by women in America. And they said, a lot of Americans now take a 40-hour work week for granted. These women, 20,000 of them, 30,000 of them were fighting to reduce the work week from 56 hours to 52 hours. They were often, forced to work late into the night, and they demanded, limits on how many hours they could work. They wanted to stop having to pay for the needle and thread. And this is one of the largest strikes in American history to that point. And what was really unusual is that many people thought that women aren't real workers. They'll just work a year or two and they'll get married and go make babies. And here the strike was led by women. And they really, for 2 months in the dead of winter in New York, they really stood solid. The police these thugs hired by the factory owners really beat the bejesus out of a lot of these women. A lot of them went to jail. And the good news is that they eventually won the strike, and they won a shorter work week. They won holiday pay for the very first time. They won less, they couldn't be forced to work as many hours at night. They no longer had to pay for needle and thread. And this was a really important victory for the labor movement overall in the United States. It was an extremely important victory for women, and it really pushed women forward. It really pushed labor forward, and created a lot of momentum for labor overall, not just in New York, but in the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right, now I want to jump to the 1930s and the Flint sit-down strike. What do you want us to remember about this chapter?
So General Motors in the 1930s was the nation's industrial colossus. It was by far the biggest, not just the biggest automaker, but the biggest company in the United States. And it fought extremely hard to beat back a union. It got police to arrest strikers, to beat up strikers. It had 200 or 300 company spies to infiltrate unionization efforts. And it was kind of crazy that this big, rich, respectable company was just so against the union when again, the workers, worked very long hours. They worked at a very hard pace. If your manager, if your boss wanted to fire you, you were just fired. You really had no recourse. And, for years, there were efforts, during the Depression, there were efforts to unionize General Motors, but they weren't getting anywhere. So finally, with Roosevelt as president, and he was pro-union, and a new law was passed that gave American workers the right to unionize, the National Labor Relations Act. Finally, a true big unionization effort gathered steam at General Motors, and they had the strategy that if they could just shut down one or two key plants in General Motors, they could shut down the whole system. And the way they did that was to do a sit down, because when in a traditional strike, workers picket outside, and then the company can send in replacement workers to do the jobs. But when you sit down at your metal stamping plant then substitute workers can't come in. So again, this strike was also for 2 months in the dead of winter in Detroit. And some of the days, the workers' wives and friends would be picketing outside in 10 degrees and 5 degrees. And they really succeeded in shutting down 95% of General Motors. So finally, General Motors cried uncle and surrendered and agreed to recognize the union. And the fact that the nation's biggest, most powerful company recognized the union, again, really created a lot of momentum for the union movement. The workers at General Motors, won big wage gains. They won a voice at work, and it was really only after the victory at Flint that the union movement in the United States really grew rapidly in the late 1930s and 1940s, and that was really the golden age of the union movement, and that helped create in the 1950s after the World War. It was the union movement led by the United Auto Workers, led by General Motors, that really played a key role in reaching contracts that built the American middle class. And then workers at Ford and Chrysler and General Electric and U.S. Steel really followed what happened at General Motors with the UAW. So the Flint strike was really one of the most important strikes in American history.
But by the 50s, America starts to turn on unions. What are some of the reasons for this, both internal and external, to organize labor?
So in my book, I really say the turning point was more the 1980s than the 1950s. During World War II, the good news was that government and business and labor really worked marvelously hand in hand to defeat a common enemy, and figured out how to maximize production, how to turn auto plants into plants that made warplanes. And there was marvelous cooperation. And in my book, I say that terrific cooperation continued into the 1950s. In the 1950s, in ways, American industry was, fortunate because it really didn't face much competition from Europe and Japan because they were still flat on their back from the war. So in ways, the 1950s were a golden age for American business and American workers and American unions. Unions really were the most, in the 1950s, I believe unions were the most powerful they ever were in American history. And they were able to pressure companies to really do more to share their profits and the prosperity with their workers. And the workers really enjoyed huge wage gains in the 1950s. And I explain in my book that there were some key labor contracts, especially between the United Auto Workers and General Motors, that went far to lift these working class auto workers really into the middle class. And that became a template that many, many other companies and unions followed. So American workers were very well paid. Companies were booming because they didn't face much foreign competition. That kind of continued into the 1960s. Fast forward into the 1970s, the economy started to stutter with the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979. Then in 1980, things really started to go south for unions in the United States for several reasons. That's when we really start to feel the fierce competition from Europe and Japan, Toyotas, Hondas, steel from Germany, steel from Russia, steel from Belgium. We started, importing TVs. So American industry was really realizing that it had to try to cut costs. And that meant it took a tougher stance towards labor. Also, there was a horrible recession in 1981-82, and industry said, we have to close plants and reduce costs. And then, Ronald Reagan, a leading conservative, some people in his administration were very anti-union, and there was a strike an illegal strike in 1981 by the nation's air traffic controllers, and Reagan basically said, this is an illegal strike. If you 11,000 air traffic controllers don't go back to work, within 2 days you're all fired. They didn't go back to work. He fired them. The union basically ceased and desisted. And that really threw labor unions very much on the defensive for the next decade. And a lot of corporations, seeing a president act so aggressively to defeat a union, I think that really emboldened corporate America to take a tougher stance against unions. And one of the points I make in my book is that for historical reasons, lots of complicated reasons, business in the United States has been far more aggressive in resisting and beating back unions than corporations in any other industrial country. And that's why, in ways, unions in the United States are weaker than in any other industrial country, far weaker than in France or Germany or Britain or Italy or Japan or South Korea.
We're speaking with Stephen Greenhouse, American labor and workplace journalist and writer. He covered labor for the New York Times for 31 years. He's the author of The Big Squeeze and, most recently, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. So, Stephen, here we are today, a low point with or without some bright spots, depending upon your view. To start with a low point, how bad is it?
So, we're talking in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And in my book, I point out that in many ways, American workers have it worse than workers in other wealthy countries, that we are the only industrial nation where every worker is not guaranteed paid vacation, where every worker is not guaranteed paid parental leave, paid maternity leave. The only other nations in the world that don't guarantee paid maternity leave are Suriname and Papua New Guinea. And we were the only industrial nation that didn't provide paid sick days. And that's very bad when you have a pandemic. So finally, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats in Congress pushed, with coronavirus threatening us terribly, for a paid sick days law to protect people. Yet corporate America pushed through this exemption in the law that exempted every company with over 500 employees, which is like, representing more than half the workers in the nation, exempted every company with more than 500 employees from having to provide paid sick days. And I think that's an example. I raised that because it shows how out of whack things are, that workers, that corporate America really rules the roost and workers often take it on the chin. So you asked me, how are things for workers now? Unions are far weaker. In the 1950s, they represented 35% of workers. Now they represent just 10%, just 1 in 10. Income inequality has grown far worse. In the book, I argue that the declining power of union has played a big role behind increased income inequality. There's been huge wage stagnation for the average worker for the past few decades. The minimum wage in the United States hasn't gone up in over 10 years, the longest in American history. It hasn't gone up. And just in many ways, workers are being squeezed. I also talk about trends like, non-compete clauses. 30, 40 years ago, they were very rare. Workers could go work, could move to any other company they wanted. Now, 30% of American workers have had to sign these non-compete clauses. So if you're a worker at the Jimmy John sandwich shop making $10 an hour or $9 an hour, and you wanted to go across the street to make $1 more an hour because you had signed a non-compete clause, you weren't able to do that. So a lot of these clauses, really favor, a lot of things that are going on really favor employers. Another thing, when we were young, unpaid internships were extremely rare. Maybe if you wanted a Hollywood job, maybe if you wanted to work at a fashion house. But now unpaid internships are all over the place. In law firms and banks, in museums, and it's and that I argue in the book that it's another way that employers are taking advantage. So I think workers, in the United States, as I said, don't have many of the very basic protections that workers in other industrial countries do. We are the only industrialized country in the world where every worker and their family is not guaranteed health coverage. And that means if, you work at a factory with 500 workers or Walmart with 300 workers and that closes, those 500 factory workers, those 300 Walmart workers, they might lose their health coverage. That would not happen in France or Germany or Britain. So we're the only industrialized country where workers can face such terrible things when they lose their job.
Mm-hmm. But it is not all doom and gloom. One of the bright spots that you see involves the Culinary Workers Union. What did they get right?
So the Culinary Union represents 60,000 hotel and restaurant workers in Las Vegas. The dishwashers, the hotel housekeepers, the assistant cooks, the bellhops. And at a time when much of organized labor is on the decline and growing weaker, that is a union that has more than tripled in size since the 1980s, going from 18,000 to 60,000. And I write a full chapter about this book, about this union local in Las Vegas, because it has done so many things right. It has done an amazing job lifting workers like hotel housekeepers, typically a low-wage marginal job, lifting over 10,000 hotel housekeepers into the middle class. I profile a hotel housekeeper at the giant hotel, the MGM Grand, Frances Garcia, and she makes $19.50 an hour, and under the union contract is guaranteed 40 hours a week. That's $780 a week, about $40,000 a year. I visited Frances and her 3 kids at her apartment. She has a lovely 3-bedroom apartment. She drives a nice Toyota Camry. She has a huge large screen TV, much bigger than mine. She has a beautiful leather couch. She's a middle-class life, even though she's a hotel housekeeper. She pays nothing in premiums towards her health coverage. Whereas the typical hotel housekeeper, non-union hotel housekeeper, makes only about $11 an hour, maybe works 30 hours a week. That's 11 times 30 is what, $330 a week, maybe $16,000, $17,000 a year. You can't live on that. You certainly can't raise a family on that. So one of the reasons I write about the culinary is they do such a great job battling for the workers, exerting pressure on the employers to lift people into the middle class. Also, we all remember in 2016, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan flipped from blue to red and favored Donald Trump and delivered the election to him. Well, Nevada, traditionally a red state, has gone blue. And I interviewed many political experts in Nevada, and they say the main reason for that is the power of the Culinary Union in getting people out to vote and educating workers and getting people to vote early. And again, that union really shows how an effective union can educate, communicate, mobilize people to vote, and really make a huge difference when average workers understand what's at stake and understand the issues.
Absolutely.
And last thing, and they also have this fabulous training academy. where they work hand in hand with the casino hotels, and that so a hotel housekeeper, if she wants to improve her station in life, can go take a course to become a cook or even a sommelier or a bartender, and these courses are free. And I've written about someone who began, an immigrant from Mexico who began as a busser, clearing food off of tables, and she took a course to become a waitress, and she doubled her pay, and then she was studying to become a sommelier, which would have really raised her. She went from $30,000 as a busser to like $50,000-$60,000 as a waiter, and now is studying for something so she'll make like $90,000-$100,000 as a sommelier. So there's an ideal career ladder that is provided for workers at the culinary if they really want to pursue it.
Now, we can't end this interview without talking about the upheaval facing workers all over the world right now, and that is, of course, the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. You noted in the New York Times there is a strong class division in how the coronavirus crisis is being experienced. What can unions do to change that?
So the class there, so like we have all these, well-paid white-collar workers, working at home, sheltering at home, kind of, fairly safe. Yet we have millions of, frontline workers, blue-collar workers, grocery workers, warehouse workers, pharmacy workers, bus drivers going to work every day, in ways risking their lives, interacting with people who might be sick, taking the subways. So, unions. So look at what happened in Detroit recently. The unions told the leading car manufacturers, we really need to shut down plants for a week or two to figure out a safety protocol so that people, don't die from touching things. People, aren't too closely together on the assembly line. Maybe there are ways to spacing out things. So, the union really sat down with management to figure that out. And then in comparison, we've seen these strikes recently at several McDonald's and several Amazon plants by non-union workers who say management is not doing nearly enough to take precautions to ensure our safety. And I wrote about this strike by McDonald's workers in San Jose. They said that management did not give them soap to wash their hands, did not give them hand sanitizer, did not give them gloves, did not give them masks. And they're saying, if management's not going to do for us what we need, we have to take the matter into our own hands. We have to engage in collective action, which is essentially what unions are about, workers banding together. And in my book, I have a big chapter about the 5 for 15 and how that has done wonders, lifting millions of workers to $15 an hour. And again, it shows that when workers really band together and act smart and strategically, they can, really make major gains. I was the very first reporter in the country to write about the 5 for 15, and they went on. About 200 workers went on strike at about 20 restaurants in New York in November 2012. And I remember they told me, "We're doing this to get a $15 wage," and I said, "That's crazy. You folks are making $7.25, $8 an hour. You'll never get $15." And here we are. 7-8 years later, and 7 states have enacted a $15 minimum wage, and like 20-30 million Americans have gotten raises as a result of the 5 for 15. So what we're seeing now in this fight about safety for coronavirus, we've seen strikes by workers at Whole Foods, McDonald's, Amazon, sanitation workers in Pittsburgh, bus drivers in Detroit and Birmingham saying, "You, our employer, are taking us and our safety for granted. You have to treat us with respect. You have to work to ensure that we're safe." And whether these workers have a union or non-union, they're realizing that they have far less power individually than they do collectively and working together. And that is in many ways, the central theme of my book, that workers may feel very beaten down, paid poorly, not treated with enough respect, not given enough safety, and they get so worked up that they really act and join together to improve their lot. And whether it's, the garment workers in 1909, the General Motors workers in Flint in 1936 and 1937, or the, African-American sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968, which I write about, they really showed that when you band together and fight together, it's really possible to make major gains and help create a fairer economy and also a fairer, more inclusive nation.
Absolutely. Stephen Greenhouse, American labor and workplace journalist and writer, covered labor for the New York Times for 31 years, author of The Big Squeeze, and most recently, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Stephen, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Would love to have you back and talk some more about it soon.
Thanks, Jim. Happy to do this.
Fantastic.
Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. Very much appreciated. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats, covering Trump during a pandemic. Bill Press with ABC's chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl on his new book, Front Row at the Trump Show.
Tell us about the first time you met Donald Trump. It wasn't when Donald Trump got to the White House. You've known him a long time. Tell us about the first time and what your first impressions were of Donald Trump.
It was such a crazy story, Bill. I was a reporter for the New York Post, and I'd only been on the job for like 6 months or so. And I was an aspiring political reporter. You know, I wanted to report on politics. I wanted to, report on City Hall. I had worked my way to be like the number 3 guy at City Hall for the New York Post. There was a new mayor there. I don't know if you remember the guy. He was a former prosecutor.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
He's a science advisor to me.
Yes. Rudy Giuliani was the new mayor. But I was at the New York Post, and there was this story that had just consumed New York, and especially New York's tabloids. News had just broken that Michael Jackson, king of pop, had married Elvis Presley's daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. I mean, this was his biggest story. So nobody cared about my little, whatever scoops I might get out of City Hall that day. So I wanted, I was an aggressive young reporter. I wanted to get in the paper. So how can I get in the paper on this story? I didn't really, have much to say about Michael Jackson, but I did notice that the two who had not been spotted in public yet, since news of their wedding had broke, their marriage had broke, were staying at Trump Tower.
Oh, yeah,
so,
of course.
Yeah, where else? So I literally, you remember phone books, Bill? The kids don't remember these things anymore. But I literally looked up the number for the Trump organization in the phone book, dialed the general number, and asked to speak to Donald Trump. Just on a whim. I was like, whatever, I'll see what I can get. And
because he runs a hotel, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, so I figured this was my way into the story. So I got connected with his secretary rather quickly, a woman named Norma Federer, who was, she died a few years ago, but she was a legendary gatekeeper for all things Trump. Basically like helped raise the kids. I mean, really a member of the family. She picked up the phone, gruff, no nonsense woman. So what do you want? And I said, well, I have a story. I'm with the New York Post. I have a story I want to pitch to Mr. Trump. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, well, why would the most famous newlyweds in the world want to have their honeymoon on Trump Tower?
Good. Yeah.
I figured, I didn't know Trump, but I figured that pitch might just somehow, resonate with him. And he called me back in less than an hour directly. The phone rang and it was him. And he said, come on up. So I grabbed got a photographer, Francis Becker.
Yeah.
We went right up to Trump Tower. And went through the police line. You can imagine because of this, everybody was trying to get a glimpse of Michael and
the
Lisa
famous
Marie.
couple, right?
I mean, the paparazzi, the local camera crews, all the New York tourists, everybody. So they had police lines all around Trump Tower, and I marched right through the entrance of Trump Tower and got whisked up to his office. and for the next hour got this ridiculously over-the-top tour of Trump Tower.
Of course. From him. Yeah.
From him. We had some ground rules. He told me that I could use this information, quoting a source in the Trump organization.
Yeah.
There's only one source in the Trump organization.
Of course.
Really, if you want a reliable information of actually what's going to happen in the White House, there's really only one source there, But
and he must have given you the sales pitch for the hotel, right?
Oh my! That was the whole thing. And then we did a. You can imagine the New York Post. We did in my book. I show some pictures, including the front page of the Post. Massive screaming headlines of their, the famous couple's honeymoon nest. He showed me, the apartment where they were staying. He showed me. I didn't see the famous couple, but I met Michael's bodyguards. He showed me the secret tunnels they used to get out, to avoid the mob outside. And then Bill, the sales pitch was incredible. He wanted me to know all the famous people who lived in Trump Tower, and he told me what floor they were on.
Oh my God!
Sophia Loren, Steven Spielberg, the British royal family. So the Post had drawing of Trump Tower with arrows pointing to where these people that wanted maybe some privacy, exactly where they lived. But to me, it was my reaction was, first of all, total showman, salesman. Actually, it was fun. It was not a serious thing at all.
Right.
And the Post ate it up, and he was so eager. And by the way, he told me, I pulled out the story again because I wrote this in 1994. And like I said, there were several stories inside the paper. I have them all still. And he told me the details of Michael's lease of the apartment.
No. Really?
All this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
How much he paid, how long it was for. But the thing is, what it was, the reason why it was so quintessentially Trump is it was a chance. It was the biggest story of that moment, in kind of public mind in New York. And he managed to, with my pitch, grab it because it made him
the story,
centerpiece of what was the biggest. So not Michael and Lisa Marie, it was him.
Right. So nothing has changed.
Absolutely nothing has changed. I have a photograph from that day. You see the two of us. I have a really bad haircut, a awful and wrinkled suit, and a really bad tie. And Donald Trump is exactly the same. Red tie that's too long, dark suit, same grin, same hair. He's probably like 30 pounds lighter, than he is now. But same. He looks exactly the same.
Yeah. So given that you've known him that long, you said 1994, let's jump to a couple of days ago at the briefing where you and Donald Trump had a little encounter. Now, I want to be sure I get the facts straight. The question posed to him was about a Health and Human Services Inspector General report that some hospitals were complaining they were not getting the protective gear that they needed. Originally asked by a Fox News reporter, I'm sorry, I don't know her name, you followed up by pointing out that this person had, in fact, worked in the previous administration in some capacity. Got it right so far?
Totally.
Okay.
Well, and to just be clear, the president kind of verbally abused the Fox News reporter for asking this question. She was specifically asking about an element of the Inspector General report regarding testing.
Yes.
That these hospitals, it's a survey of 330 hospitals, that they were saying that they would send the tests out and the labs weren't getting back for a week or longer, and this was a problem.
Right.
So he was mad at her and said, well, what is the name of the Inspector General? What is the name? And, and she didn't have it. So he moved on, and I quickly looked and picked up the name and all this. And I said, Mr. Trump, here's the Inspector General's name. And by the way, this is a serious question. It's not the Inspector General's opinion. It was based on a survey of more than 300 hospitals. And the real question is, have you fixed the obvious problems with testing? And that's when he was like, well, how long is this? How long has she worked? Who hired her? And then I didn't have that information at the tip of my finger. So he went on somewhere else, and I quickly looked, and she became the acting inspector general in January of this year.
Under President Trump.
Under President Trump.
He appointed her, yes.
So I said, wait a minute, back to this, January of this year. And then he was like, well, we're going to have to look into this. And then he stews, and you can tell he's angry, and he takes a step back. And then the exchange that has been played a lot that you're referring to is he comes out and he looks at me again and says, well, how long was she, she been around?
Let me interrupt you there, and let's listen to that exchange, because not everybody on the podcast has heard it yet. But with that background, right, he's coming back to how long has she worked, basically, administration. Here we go.
Did serve in the previous administration.
Oh, you didn't tell me that. Oh, I see. You didn't tell me that, John. You didn't tell me that. Did serve in the previous administration. You mean the Obama administration. Thank you for telling me that. See, there's a typical fake news deal.
You asked me when she was appointed. I told you when she was appointed.
You're a third-rate reporter, and what you just said is a disgrace, okay? You asked me, you said, sir, just got appointed. Take a look at what you said now. I said, when did this person, how long in government? Well, it was appointed in the Obama administration. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. You will never make it. Go ahead.
There it is. You'll never make it. Your career's over. But isn't this a classic response? Don't answer the question, attack the messenger, or attack, in this case, the inspector general.
But by the way, yes, totally. But by the way, another thing that I tried to, as he was going on and on, I was trying to say you can't hear, is that if everybody on the stage, Admiral Giroir, Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, all served in the previous administration. They all did. I mean, everybody except for him and Pence, everybody on the stage. It's hardly like a strike against anybody. These are career government servants. So anyway, but it is classic. He never actually answers the question.
Does it bother you that he attacks you personally? Third-rate reporter?
What bothers me is that he's not answering the question. And that's where I'm like, now, wait a minute. Let's get back. This is not about me. It's not about, it's not about his trying to intimidate me. It's about the testing. Remember, this is ultimately about the problems, the obvious massive problems that we have had with the coronavirus testing. That's the question. And we now have evidence based on 300 plus hospitals that this was a widespread problem. So have you fixed the problem? That's the question. So that's what upset me. I've gotten used to the insults are irrelevant. It's like, whatever. It's like when he called my friend Peter Alexander with NBC a terrible reporter. I mean, it's fine. It's like, who cares about the insult? It's just the problem is that it is an obvious diversion from the underlying question.
And it's not the first time, according to your book, that he has attacked you personally and used obscenities on stage or backstage toward you. I guess it goes with the Trump territory. But it does get to the question, again, we're talking with Jonathan Karl, chief White House correspondent for ABC News, and his hot new book just out this week, Front Row at the Trump Show. John, what does this say about the value of these daily briefings at the White House? Are we learning anything from them? Should the networks carry them? Or are they just the new version of Trump campaign rallies?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at that question. One is, are we learning anything and should we be covering them? And I think it's uneven, but I think we do learn things at these rallies, not necessarily from the president himself, but we get a chance to question the others. And when there is something, I think it's also important to try to hold him accountable with questions as well. But the other question, Bill, is should the networks be carrying them live? Because does this become kind of like the quarantine version of the rally? He can't go out and do a rally anymore. He lives. It's like oxygen for him, those rallies. Remember, he did his first rally after the election, before he became president. I mean, he couldn't stand just being holed up in the transition. He had to get out and campaign, even though he hadn't even been sworn in yet.
Right.
So he needs that. He needs that outlet. And, whether or not networks should be carrying these from beginning to end, I mean, I think you can make a strong argument that just cover them, get the information, digest it, give some context, and then report it. You don't need to go wall to wall. Now, that said, anybody can watch this stuff. I mean, it's live streamed everywhere. I mean, ABC hasn't carried them wall to wall for a while now, but we do have our digital streaming, live stream, and anybody who is an ABC viewer can get on their phone, get in and watch the whole thing. And look, this is the kind of crisis that people want to hear everything. I mean, so they're watching Cuomo, start to finish. They'll watch. I mean, so that's fine. But in terms of like CNN, MSNBC, the networks, should we be carrying it on our big? I don't know.
Yeah, right. And I think very fewer people are carrying it wall to wall.
Yeah,
some
because they're 2 hours long. I mean, some of these go more than 2 hours.
Yeah. And some news outlets are not even sending their reporters. Some have suggested, John, I think maybe Joy Behar suggested to you on The View, that reporters, if they're insulted, they ought to just get up and walk out that person who's insulted, and the other reporters sort of, to show support for that reporter.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we actually, that suggestion goes back before these briefings. I mean, that goes back to when Sean Spicer had some of his absolutely ridiculous press briefings. I mean, those were, I think,
yeah, I was there.
Far less valuable than these on their worst day. Was those Spicer briefings, and people would say, "Stop going, send the interns in." And I don't know. I mean, as a White House reporter, the president's at the podium. I'm going to be there. I mean, and if he's going to insult me, I really don't care. Right. And if he's going to insult my friend Peter Alexander or my friend Yamiche Alcindor or any of the others, I don't think that they should care either. But what I think we need to do is what I was doing in that instance, which was following up on a question that he was refusing to ask that another reporter asked. And I think you're starting to see more of that. And I wish that my colleagues did that all the time.
Right. Amen to that. I wish that for a long time, even back in the Obama years, I thought there was not enough of that. People would move on to another topic rather than follow up and help each other out. One question about the briefings, another one, I guess, is how can Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, what do you think? How can they stand there when Donald Trump goes off on these rants or is just telling things that are just basically untrue? You were there, I think, the same day I was when he vaunted these, was promoting these new miracle drugs, right?
Yeah.
Basically nothing to them. And Fauci and Birx, how do they just stand there without saying, wait a minute?
So, I mean, you can often see the pained look in their faces. But I think that they are great public servants who know that it's really important that this is a, I mean, I don't know, Bill, I think it's the greatest crisis of my lifetime. And
absolutely.
And, I think that it's so incredibly important to have the actual experts there. And for all of the president's, tweeting and the stuff he says and the crazy stuff about miracle cures and going back to church on Easter and all the stuff he says, on the major decision points so far, he's actually by and large taken the advice of the experts. And heaven knows what we'd be into if they weren't there. So I think that they have to figure a way to navigate, not get fired by him, but not be total, sycophants the way others have been over the last 3 years, and to kind of walk. It's a really tough line, and I admire them doing. I don't know if you there was this thing after the whole third-rate reporter at the end of that briefing, the very, very end, long after Trump had gone. Pence and Birx and Fauci are left, and then the briefing ends and they leave. Fauci's the last person to go out the door. And as he went out the door, he turned in my direction I gave him a little salute, and he did this. He gave me like a little thumbs up, and that became this whole conspiracy meme.
Well, of course, no. You guys have been sending hand signals back and forth. We know that this is the deep state at its worst, and you are part of it. See,
it's just unbelievable.
Bill Press talking with ABC's chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl, on his new book, Front Row at the Trump Show. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Katherine Stewart, Stephen Greenhouse, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.